represent a response, at least in part, to criminalization. And perhaps during the discussion, we can talk about some of the issues with it as kind of a partial response. But in the United States today, there's an estimated 10.4 million undocumented immigrants. That means that throughout the United States, many cities have substantial undocumented communities. Undocumented communities whose members are neighbors, their friends, their coworkers, right? They're central to the life of that community. And yet, because of their immigration status, they may be afraid to call the police if they witness a crime, or if they're the victim of a crime. And in particular, we see this bears a really heavy burden on undocumented women, who are very unlikely to report domestic abuse, sexual assault, or rape if they feel that local police may inquire into their immigration status. And this was one of the things that we saw happen right after Trump was elected. Heavily Latino cities saw a massive drop in reported domestic violence, sexual assault, and rape. Just as a result of a restrictionist president coming into office and saying, we're going to deport as many of you as we can get. And so sanctuary policies represent a response to that, because the reality is that it's not good for the community, for the city, or the county to have a marginalized group of people who cannot access resources, who cannot call the police. And so that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit. So sanctuary policies really kind of spring onto the national agenda in 2015. They had existed long before 2015, but nobody really paid any attention to them. Occasionally Fox News would talk a little bit. Any Fox News fans in the room? No, you guys actually have good news stations over here. But Fox News, would talk about the issue occasionally, right? Lurid descriptions of people killed by undocumented immigrants, or either, deliberately or accidentally through like auto accidents, drunk driving, that kind of stuff. But then on July 1st, 2015, Catherine Steinle is walking on a pier with her father. She's struck in the back by a bullet, and she dies. This is right when Trump is announcing his presidency, or his candidacy for the presidency. And you can see the juxtaposition down here. Well, you can see Raf's head largely, but you can see this juxtaposition that is very common in a lot of fear-mongering around race. Not only in the United States, but you see the same thing in the UK, you see the same thing in the Europe. The juxtaposition of a young, dark-skinned man with a young, light-skinned woman. Right? Because one of the things that is very rooted in our ideas of race, right? Ideas that, we have in the United States but come from Europe originally, right? Is this threat to white women, right? Posed by dangerous non-white men. And it's been something that's been used to defend lynching laws in the United States in the early part of the 20th century, right? And Jim Crow laws and all of these other things. The linkage to sanctuary is that Garcia Zarate had been arrested on numerous occasions, mostly not for any, really, high-level stuff, but he'd been taken into custody on a number of occasions. And he had been taken into custody on a drug charge not long before Kate Steinle was killed. He was released because of San Francisco's sanctuary policy. Which in part states that they won't hold people on ICE detainer requests. And an ICE detainer, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, essentially can issue a request that local law enforcement hold someone until they can be taken into custody for processing, deportation, and potentially detention if they're re-entrants or if they are charged. Now, eventually, Garcia Zarate is acquitted of murder charges because the gun was accidentally discharged. The bullet actually ricocheted off the ground before striking Miss Steinle. It was a tragedy, but it provided fodder for Donald Trump to really go after. There's his face. You're going to see it again, by the way, if you pay any attention, because you guys will get Boris Johnson again, we'll get Donald Trump, and it'll be like going in a horrible, horrible time machine, stepping back a couple years. So Trump really takes up this issue of sanctuary cities and undocumented immigration. He runs hard on it, right? He wants to be essentially a strongman president, right? That's the image he wants to present. He will protect you. And he has a lot of, internationally, there's a lot of similar leaders, right? Bolsonaro in Brazil, Duterte in the Philippines. Well, Duterte is no longer president of the Philippines, but when he was, right? Similarly, running on this message of, I will protect you from these bad, scary things. And that resonates with voters, right? Because one of the things that we expect of government is that government will protect us. But, of course, if you paid any attention to Donald Trump, he said a lot of the quiet parts out loud when it came to racism, right? In the past, right-wing leaders and, far-right Republicans had usually used dog whistles. And some of you have probably heard that term before, but essentially symbolic ways of gesturing towards race and kind of racial animus without explicitly stating it. But of course, Trump kicks the door open, right? And, he says, when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. I left the last part out. He had a kind of pause, and he said, and some I assume are good people, right? But really, what this was about was scaring people into voting for, right? And, this is one of his campaign advertisements. Coming out very hard against sanctuary cities because his argument is that they resulted in all of these needless deaths. And he brought the families of individuals killed by undocumented immigrants, either accidentally or deliberately, on tour with him. They were at his campaign events. He would point to them in the crowd. He would bring them up on stage and have them tell their stories. Now, all of those things are tragedies, of course, but you also could have filled that entire auditorium with the families of victims of native-born Americans, right? Because actually American citizens actually offend at far higher rates than any immigrant groups, legal or illegal. So just in the context of the United States, a sanctuary city is defined as a city or police department that has passed a resolution or ordinance expressly forbidding city or law enforcement officials from inquiring into immigration status or limiting cooperation with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Now, sanctuary policies themselves exist along a spectrum. Some are largely symbolic in nature, right? They gesture towards, they may have language regarding, we are a city that welcomes all people regardless of legal status, nationality, race, so on and so forth. But then on the far end of the spectrum, there are cities that very specifically prohibit local officials from asking about immigration status, from assisting ICE, from sharing information. And the purpose of that is to try to allow undocumented residents of those communities to move in those spaces with at least some sense of safety, right? Although it should be pointed out that immigration enforcement in the United States is the sole jurisdiction of the federal government. So state and local governments are not required to assist federal officials. The flip side of that, though, is they can't prevent immigration enforcement. So a sanctuary city can do these things, but it doesn't prevent Immigration and Customs Enforcement from coming in and conducting an immigration raid on a Latino neighborhood or a workplace that's believed to have some undocumented immigrants in it. The first sanctuary policy in the United States, and Berkeley is very proud of this. It's in 1971, which was probably before most of you were born, I'm assuming. Didn't get a laugh out of that? Oh, there we go. The first sanctuary city policy was passed in 1971 by the city of Berkeley, and it wasn't meant to shelter refugees or asylees or immigrants. It was meant to shelter the men of the USS Coral Sea who did not want to be deployed to Vietnam. And a number of churches in the Bay Area had taken those individuals in and said, we will offer you shelter and food so that you can't be sent to fight in a war, which by 1971 most of America knew was horribly unjust, was leading to massive numbers of casualties for Americans, but especially for the Vietnamese people. And so that was the very first policy. And the reason I talk about that is it's important because that policy evolves. Berkeley is not rewriting these policies. What they're essentially doing is they're taking that first policy in 1971, they're tweaking the language a little bit. They're strengthening some parts of it. But that's what we see in as the purpose of sanctuary shifts across 3 periods. And what happens in 1985 is the target group for sanctuary shifts. It is no longer individuals who don't want to be deployed to Vietnam. It is now Central American asylum seekers, specifically Salvadoran and Guatemalan asylum seekers. But you can see, well, if you can read it, you can see that from this from the second resolution that a lot of the language is borrowed and adapted. And the same thing happens in 2007. More is added to it, but the language doesn't change a lot, especially in the early parts of the resolution, and actually references those earlier resolutions. So the first wave of sanctuary policies in the United States runs from about 1983 to 1989, and it's meant to demonstrate solidarity with the sanctuary movement. The sanctuary movement was a faith-based movement that took Guatemalan and Salvadoran asylum seekers from the border, transported them to various places of faith around the country, and offered them shelter. Why churches and synagogues and other places of faith? Well, the optics of going in and conducting an immigration raid in a church is something that most presidents don't want to do, especially if they want to get reelected. So it's a way of both raising consciousness, right? Because they're not trying to hide these individuals. They're very much saying we are sheltering these individuals because they should not be sent back to Guatemala or El Salvador because they will be killed. And the overall acceptance rate for asylum seekers at the time was around 26%, but for Salvadorans it was 2.6%, and for Guatemalans it was less than 1%. The reason for that low acceptance rate is that the United States government was funding governments in Guatemala and El Salvador who were committing many of the atrocities. And so they wanted these individuals removed. Now, the sanctuary movement claimed that the reason that this should be legal is that the United States was actually in violation of the Geneva Conventions, its own Refugee Act of 1980, and the 1967 protocol relating to the status of refugees. So they were saying, we're not doing anything illegal. What is actually the removal of these individuals is actually what is illegal. Now, a number of cities announced solidarity with the sanctuary movement, right? They issue resolutions saying no local official will inquire into immigration status. But the second wave of sanctuary policies comes after the 9/11 attacks in the United States. George W. Bush starts a big immigration crackdown. The Immigration and Naturalization Services is shifted over to the Department of Homeland Security, renamed Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, is much more aggressive in their tactics. And so we see a response. We see more sanctuary policies being introduced. And then the last set, somewhat unsurprisingly, is introduced when Trump wins the presidency. So as a direct reaction to Trump. And this is from the University Baptist Archive in Seattle, Washington. This is a listing. By June 1987, there were 393 different sanctuary sites spread across the United States. And it also has a breakdown by denomination. But what we see is, as the target group of these policies starts to shift, right? Asylum seekers and refugees are often seen much more sympathetically than economic migrants. And as a result of that, we start to see how media frames the question of both undocumented entry and sanctuary much differently. And they start relying more and more on narratives of criminality and also references to partisan sources. And we see a decrease in framing in terms of the moral obligation that we have, right, to these individuals, right? This as a human rights issue. Similarly, we see something that was print media before. This is broadcast media, so television. We see something similar happen with television, and you can also see how substantially, how much the coverage of sanctuary grows as a direct result of Donald Trump in 2015, 2016. Now, because of Trump, sanctuary policies become part of the culture war, meaning that, like undocumented immigration, guns, abortion, right? There is an ideologically correct position to have, right? If you're a Democrat, you believe X. If you're a Republican, you believe Y. And what we see is that Democrats start learning the correct position, meaning that Democratic support for sanctuaries as a result of Donald Trump's opposition to sanctuary begins to grow, right? Because you're having polarization around the issue. Now, that doesn't mean Democrats know anything more about sanctuary policies or have really thought about them, but they know what the politically or ideologically correct position is on those policies. But the introduction of more sanctuary policies results in a reaction at the state level. So at the state level, if anti-sanctuary legislation is introduced, or legislation prohibiting cities from not inquiring into immigration status or cooperating, this preempts those local policies. And so we have Texas leads the way with SB 4, and what we find is the number of anti-sanctuary bills also goes way, way up. Interestingly, some of you may have written a paper at one point and your professor ran a plagiarism check on your paper and hopefully found no plagiarism. But the same can't be said for the pieces of anti-sanctuary legislation. ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council. ALEC is an interesting institution in that it brings together elected representatives and private business interests and groups. What this means is, in the United States, we have private prisons. Private prisons are members of ALEC, and they helped draft a piece of legislation in 2010 that then served as the basis. As you can see, this is a plagiarism check here, that served as the basis for most of that anti-sanctuary legislation. And what we found was legislators who were affiliated with ALEC, if a state had a large number of legislators affiliated with ALEC, that the likelihood of anti-sanctuary legislation passing was significantly higher. Now, one of the last things I want to talk about briefly before I move through just some other findings of our book really quickly, because I only have 1 minute, so I'm going to start talking really fast. There's a narrative that I mentioned at the beginning around undocumented immigration broadly, and crime. And we know this isn't true. There's a number of empirical studies going all the way back to 1931 debunking these claims. But the first thing we looked at when we started looking at sanctuary is, can we show that sanctuary policies don't make a city less safe? And there's a couple different ways to do this. I'm going to show the first one, right? Basically, if sanctuary policies increase crime, then after a sanctuary policy is passed, you should start to see, holding other variables equal, you should start to see crime increase in that city. Can anybody tell me what this means? It means there is no relationship, because some cities have less crime, some cities have more crime. What we would expect if there was a relationship between sanctuary policies and crime is that the majority, if not all of those cities, would be grouped on that right-hand side, and they're not. So we find no evidence for that. So there's no support for this idea that sanctuary increases any kind of criminal behavior in a city. And in fact, other researchers have in some cases, using different sets of methodologies, different measurement units, so looking at counties instead of cities, some have found that sanctuary policies actually seem to be associated with lower crime rates in a city. That's not what we found, though. What we did find also in the book, though, is that one of the things that restrictionist legislation, right, anti-sanctuary bills, like Texas's SB 4, what they do is they do decrease the likelihood that immigrants will contact police. And the way we looked at that is we looked at calls to 911 from immigrant-heavy neighborhoods in El Paso, Texas, a border town. What we found is there's a clear breakpoint after SB 4 is passed where you see the number of 911 calls drop off substantially, meaning that immigrants are reporting fewer crimes, meaning that those communities are actually becoming less safe as a result of this legislation that's being passed supposedly to keep the members of that community safer. And lastly, the candidacy and presidency of Donald Trump increased polarization, as I mentioned, around sanctuary. Most people had not even really thought of sanctuary all that much. I first wrote a paper on sanctuary as a graduate student all the way back in 2009, and it was terrible. And if any of you are master's students or you'll write really bad papers, I will say don't throw them out, because I buried that paper in a box, and when I saw Trump making those claims, I dug it back out of the box. And you couldn't use it for much, but it had a whole bunch of citations, which is usually the first step in any research project, is looking at what's been written. And so that served as the basis for moving forward and looking at things like partisan polarization, right? What predicted pro and anti-sanctuary legislation, media coverage. And we also did find, lastly, that sanctuary policies did seem to have a positive effect on Latino political incorporation. So not talking just about members of the undocumented community or the immigrant community, but Latino Americans. You had higher voter turnout in areas that had sanctuary policies. You had greater Latino participation on the police force in those areas. So it seemed to have a positive effect for Latino members of the community, probably by creating, what they perceived as a more welcoming environment, or a place where they were viewed as equals. They didn't have to worry about being asked about their immigration status constantly or something along those lines. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end, but I'll stop talking now.
Please. But basically, our presentation is structured in this way. So firstly, is a little bit of an introduction on what this City of Sanctuary is in the UK. And then I will cover what the academic literature says about City of Sanctuary here in the UK, highlighting both the strengths and the weaknesses of the City of Sanctuary as a movement. Then Sophie will go on to discuss this action plan of the City of Sanctuary here in the UK that entails these three different moments of learn, embed, and share. And Sophie will provide a contextualized perspective of what this means in Lewisham and Greenwich. And then I will present the report, Making Greenwich a Borough Sanctuary, and the key findings that has been realized jointly by the Borough Sanctuary Group in Greenwich. And then we'll discuss way forward, so I'm not going to spend long on this. Okay, great. Yes, just a brief definition of what the Borough Sanctuary, the City of Sanctuary movement here. It was created in 2007 in Sheffield. It is an umbrella organization. And if you consider the fact that most of its members are actually part-time and they are spread across the UK, it's actually quite successful. Because it includes more than 120 community groups and is divided in different strands. So you have museums, you have schools, you have universities, and the University of Greenwich right now is trying to apply to acquire a sanctuary status. Here, I'm not going to cover this it's a bit much, but you can, because this is this infographic, which is quite quick to capture. You can see that yes, there's quite a lot of City of Sanctuary regional groups, and then there's also library, there's schools, there's community gardens. You can see here how it is, and there's quite a lot of resources and, online, including webinars. There's quite a few people who are actually subscribing to the City of Sanctuary magazine.
I'm going to speak a little bit to the theory of change, but I'm not an expert on this, so do be patient with me. They work at a micro and a macro level. So the micro level is us kind of at the grassroots, embedding welcome, embedding solidarity. That might look like welcome movements. So sometimes you have things like buddy schemes or events that welcome people into the borough. And then it could also look like, and we'll come to this, what local authorities are embedding within their own practices for welcome. And then we have this macro level, which is more mainstream organisations. It's these big partnerships. It's the more national look. We tend to work more so at the micro level just because we're in a grassroots organisation. And it's really about social contact, this idea of movement building and turning our feelings of wanting welcome into a clear action plan. This is the Council of Sanctuary Awards criteria. So the place that we do most of our actual campaigning and policy work is at the level of the local council, and that's because the local council has a surprising amount of power in the UK. They are in charge of housing strategy, they are in charge of adult social care, they are in charge of things like transport and making sure children are in schools. All that stuff, access to welfare benefits, comes under local authorities. And so it makes sense then for us to work with local authorities when we're attempting to make places more sanctuary based. And the way that this happens is through the three strands of learn, embed and share. So learning is about taking an active approach and finding out what it is to be a sanctuary seeker, what kind of life that means you're living, what kind of barriers you're facing. Embed is about making sure that within your services there are practices that ensure that people are protected, that they're welcome, that you can build cohesion. And then share is about when you have developed some sort of best practice, making sure that people know about it, because there's no point having these really good sanctuary policies that no one knows or cares about and people can't access. Oh, okay. This is their very clear. This is actually quite nice of you. So they broadly define their activities like this. So City of Sanctuary is this kind of national movement. The reason that we engage with Borough of Sanctuary is because London is a really big city and has very different demographics depending on where you're living. And so we took it and we boroughfied it. But in places like Sheffield and Manchester, it's still kind of the City of Sanctuary movement. So they're working with local communities who offer kind of, like I said, buddy systems. It could be practical advice. It could be focusing on contributions. A really important thing I think about the City of Sanctuary is that we look to protect sanctuary seekers. So it doesn't matter whether you are a refugee, an asylum seeker, someone that's undocumented. Actually, a lot of those distinctions are made into distinctions because it makes the environment really confusing and complex and really difficult to navigate, and therefore puts people off and creates a sense of fear and division. So we work with sanctuary seekers holistically.
It's quite interesting because that definition of City of Sanctuary was put together by an academic working in conjunction with two key City of Sanctuary people to really try and define what City of Sanctuary was. I think it's also quite interesting because the early literature of that it was in 2010, and now, but since, the City of Sanctuary has changed quite a lot, especially because since 2019 there is this new network of local authorities that have defined much better and much more clearly the type of remit to what they are trying to achieve. So at this point, the City of Sanctuary was still something that was very cultural, not really challenging the governmental or the national state. It was really about building a positive visions of city, for cities to be proud, to be welcoming. But at that point, perhaps it wasn't as developed division as it is today. Obviously, that kind of the document also highlights the challenges that already then were being identified. So, what is a culture of hospitality? Can we agree on a culture of hospitality that has the same meaning for everyone? And I'm gonna explain that a little bit more clear later. And then there was already this sense that there was an idealistic nature of defining a better future for migrants. What are we promising? Is it what we're actually trying to deliver? There is a clear sense that actually at a local level, people are trying to do things that actually are not really easy, because at a national level, we have the hostile environment. And we know what the hostile environment is, and all this set of policy and practices that they're not very favorable to migrants, especially migrants who are illegalized by the system. Right to work is an essential battle, again, that Sheffield has been fighting already at the time, but then the city of Sanctuary has been criticized for the strategies that it has adopted for this type campaign, because they only relied on petitioning or writing letters, but not being radical enough. So the academic literature really puts together quite a lot of criticism to what the city of Sanctuary is. On the one hand, there is an acknowledgement that this work is very useful. On the other hand, they have identified those areas that actually lack efficacy, or maybe they are not radical enough. Okay, I'm not going to spend too long on this, but basically the literature really points to the fact that there are both effective and ineffective practices that are carried out by the city of Sanctuary. Just to give you a quick example. So in terms of effective practices, this is great that they have like conversation clubs for people whose English is not the first language. They have like board game evenings. They have community gardens. They have all, and say blogging workshops, and including storytelling. But the storytelling that they produce, some of the storytelling is really going to reinforce certain dominant narratives that are already professed by the central government. So rather than arguing that, for instance, there are refugees or asylum seekers who had to do immoral things, such as pay for smugglers or lying at the border about their age, and acknowledge that these people still have the right to be acknowledged as refugees. They tend to reproduce these dominant narratives to produce the moral migrant, the moral refugee, who is actually the pure, the one who has been victimized, the one who has been raped, the one who has gone through hardship or torture. See, so how this then representation is really central and needs to be really deeply scrutinized. Also, other critique really point to the top-down nature of the City of Sanctuary movement, the fact that actually is not led by people who have experience of asylum, and also this, again, reproducing the natural environment in which it was founded. I particularly enjoyed reading the article by Begelman, because she talks about the temporality of waiting and how even waiting is used from a governmental perspective as a tool for control. And I'm not going to spend any more time for this because I've been talking French. Please,
So I'll talk a little bit about LRMN. So we're a grassroots charity. We're based in South East London in Lewisham, but we work kind of pan-London. And we support people from sanctuary-seeking backgrounds with things like immigration advice, with wellbeing services, mental health. We support particularly women who have been through gender-based abuse. And we do campaigning work and some emergency support as well. And I think a very central part of LRMN's work is about empowering people to rebuild their lives and to make systemic change. So any campaign that we take part in is led by and involves people with lived experience, because it's important. So we kind of use City of Sanctuary. People like City of Sanctuary. They like the language of it. They like that it's quite soft and welcoming and likable. And so we use it as an umbrella to make quite significant change. So we try and push relatively radical challenges to the hostile environment under this umbrella of like welcome and refuge and sanctuary because it's likeable. A thing that's worth noting about it in Lewisham, where we mainly do our sanctuary work, is that 52% of the residents, according to the latest census, come from an ethnic minority background. And also that we are the 7th most deprived borough in London. So there is also often, as people know, migration is not just kind of a standalone thing. Like people have different statuses, they come from different places, but things like gender and race are overlapping, and we find that intersection quite difficult. So in Lewisham, we campaigned through the Lewisham Migration Forum, which was initially started up by the council because they were like, we desperately want to be a council of sanctuary, and they are the first council of sanctuary in London, which they tell us at any given moment, and they are very proud of. And it is this kind of migration forum was kind of first started by them. It brings together anyone that's working with migrants, refugees, or asylum seekers in Lewisham, and we provide strategy, vision, governance, and we're kind of supported by the steering group. And then we have these streams of sanctuary, which are where people can get awards, apply, change their practices, get awards. So schools, universities, gardens, libraries. So it's these two mechanisms that support us to make Lewisham into a place of sanctuary and resist the hostile environment. Here is a really fun list of things that we have done. Like I said, learn, embed, share can be implemented in kind of whatever way you want. So we try and push quite high standards, and we particularly push, as I said before, that we're not making changes purely for people of refugee status who maybe people are a little bit more sympathetic towards, that we're pushing for anyone from a sanctuary seeking background. I will pick on like actually interesting ones for you. So maybe a quite interesting one is in 2020 actually, we launched an inquiry for Lewisham and Greenwich NHS Trust into migrant charging. Many people, when they interact with the NHS, if they do not come from a regularised status, will be charged. So people will come and give birth, and then they will be given £5,000 bills for doing so. Often these people are destitute and actually shouldn't be charged in the first place. We found that Lewisham was using a credit checker to check whether people could be charged, which was a really problematic practice, and so we were like, this is a really cruel system, you're causing people so much more stress. It actually goes against this idea of the NHS doing no harm and being a free and accessible service. What are you going to do about it? And eventually rallied them into running an inquiry into their charging practices, and they came up with kind of 39 recommendations, and they've been implementing those recommendations to change the charging culture within the NHS. Obviously, in an ideal world, people would not get charged, but it has made a difference to the lives of the people that we're working with, and that's what we quite like about Lewisham Borough Sanctuary and the Borough Sanctuary movement, is it's very tangible for people. For example, the free school meals, we have a policy that's now national, which is great, but I think we were the first to implement it, where people who were no recourse to public funds, so couldn't access public safety nets, were not able to send their children to school and get free school meals. They were having to pay for their meals. These are people who can't access anything, they probably don't have the right to work, very difficult to find a way to feed your children. And so we kind of ran this long campaign about allowing free school meals for children whose parents are no recourse to public funds, which made a huge difference, really significant for a lot of families that we're working with. Another thing was removing the embedded home office worker who was at Lewisham Council, who used to sit in on meetings and be like, well, you know, you're entitled to these things, but like you're also entitled to leave and go back to wherever it was you came from, which was really terrifying for a lot of people, and so they wouldn't access services they were more than entitled to access. So that was one of our big campaign wins. And then now we're going straight through to welcoming Ukrainian refugees, to pushing against the anti-refugee bills that have been put through. And they are recently looking to employ a borough sanctuary program manager, so someone that is resourced. These are our fun plans moving forward, so continuing to build on our sanctuary work, working on some asylum hotels. This is a really difficult area of work because asylum hotels technically belong to the Home Office, so they are national. But local authorities have power over safeguarding. Safeguarding can mean any number of things. And so our question is, how do we make all the issues in there fall something under safeguarding so that we can do something about it? And then things like making sure that there are no links with the hostile environment, training on cultural competency, improving housing and access to healthcare, which is really, really fun work.
Amazing. And if I have a couple of minutes, I can try and cover what the important learning in Greenwich was by listening to more than 400 people. So basically, amazing organizations were involved. Lucian Refugee Migrant Network was leading these listings, which were a combination of formal and informal moments where more than 400 people were listened to, but also these other fantastic organizations took part in the exercise. So in terms of listening, people were asked how do they, if they were able to build in Greenwich the type of life that they were envisioning when they arrived, and these are the origins of the people who took part in the listenings. And what they said, and they pointed to, is the fact that in Greenwich they feel really safe in the borough, and that they find schools are really important resources to establish connections. But also they really benefit from volunteering opportunities. But in terms of areas of improvement that they identified, they highlighted different areas, and really broadly speaking, in the strands of rights, healthcare, housing, cultural language barriers, and work. And you can see here, for instance, when it comes to healthcare, there is this fear of accessing doctors because, again, it's part of the hostile environment. Until recently, the NHS Digital would communicate to the Home Office personal data that were stored in practices. So you can see in GPs practices, so you can see how people with irregular migration status would be terrified by this. But also, there are issues around housing, lack of affordable housing, which is quite common in London, but also the conditions of the actual temporary accommodations that they are given. And then they also raised cultural and language barriers, lack of accessibility to information for ESOL, and interestingly, also gender differences in the ways in which these local services are accessed, because women tend to access services much more, as opposed to men who are more fearful to be, say, deported or imprisoned. So the recommendations really go in the direction of building a network of safe surgeries, where surgeries commit to not doing this transmission of data, but also trying to build a person-centered approach to housing, where people don't feel pressurized to accept substandard housing, for instance, removing that, like Sophie said before, the embedded Home Office working within Greenwich Council, which is being currently negotiated, if I remember correctly, and then these other recommendations, and I feel that perhaps the removing the embedded Home Office working within Greenwich is what resonates more with the type of city of sanctuary movement that you have in the US, right? The website for the report, where normally the report is accessible, is down, but you can access the report if you're interested in reading it from the Nisham Refugee Migration Network website.
Greenwich is a little bit further behind Lewisham, and Lewisham, to their credit, have done quite a good job of trying to reach out to Greenwich and share their best practice with them, because they do have some really good practice. And so moving forward, this is kind of what we're focusing on. We have a co-production strategy meeting with the council in the coming weeks, where we'll be talking to them about building their sanctuary strategy and what it needs to look like. I'm expecting there to be a bit of pushback, but we'll see what we can do. Mainly it's also about like growing awareness of our group. Like at the moment we have maybe 20, 30 members, but the power in making any sort of campaign change is when you have many, many people behind you. So that's a really important thing for us. And then holding Queen Elizabeth QE, the hospital, really accountable on some of its charging practices, and just thinking particularly about, even within the council, small things that they can change, which don't actually require much of a, often we get told, oh, but like budget. Things like firewalls and data protection don't take much budget. Things like cultural competency training that we can provide don't take much budget. So it's about also finding areas that we can be like, well, we're here to support you, so like let us. And then I guess a couple of learnings that might be helpful are that real welcome is not just being like, hi, we've got things translated in several languages, which is really important, but actually it's about making practical change, including and empowering people with lived experience. We do our very best, like I said, to have people with lived experience really at the centre of our work, and that's a lot of my job, in a way that is really trauma-informed and not burdensome, and people can jump in and jump out whenever feels good for them. Taking a local approach needs national thinking. If we are working in this little silo of Lewisham and Greenwich and not engaging with the changes happening at the national level, then we're going to be out of step, and that's not going to be good. And then this thing of broader alliances. It's not just anyone working in migration. It's not people who come from migrant backgrounds necessarily. Well, mostly is. It's also people like anti-raids groups, it's faith groups, it's the whole council. People need buy-in in order to make significant change, and that comes back to this idea of like broadening visibility and people being interested, and it's really crucial for making kind of active change.
So moving forward, we would like to actually also expand on the evidence base that's been created through the report, part of the learning from the from people who have experience of asylum, and we'd like to then use peer researchers to go out in the community, do interviews, collect more data, and then also thinking about engaging migrants in hotels, because there's quite a few Afghani people still in temporarily accommodated in hotels in Greenwich through hard-based activities that we are now in the process of thinking about. So thank you for listening.